Guys, guess what? Okay, I have a really, really good idea. How about instead of like me giving you grades in this class for like um, doing well on quizzes or writing assignments, that's kind of boring and, it's not really profitable. How about we turn this class into like a multi-level marketing scheme? Okay, right? So here's how it works. You will go around selling stuff to people, and I'll take like a 50% cut of anything that you sell. And the more stuff that you sell, the better your grade in the class. Okay? Good idea, right? Right? No, that's a really bad idea. Okay, so turning a philosophy class into a multi level marketing scheme would be pretty fucked up. But you might say, why would that be fucked up? Maybe it would be a bad idea because multi level marketing is a bad idea in general, but maybe it would be a bad idea because if I turned you into salespeople who get paid on commission, I would be entering into a conflict of interest. Okay, so one major type of moral problem that can come up again and again in a business context is what's called conflict of interest. So we might define a conflict of interest as a situation where a person has an obligation and then they inappropriately take on some other conflicting obligation or incentive. You might also define it as a situation where one person inappropriately takes on two roles or two jobs which they can't perform well at the same time. Let's look at a handful of pretty clear cases of conflict of interest for starters. So, sometimes in real estate deals, you'll have a situation where a single real estate broker represents both the buyer and the seller for some property. Okay, right? So, like, I'm trying to sell my house, you're trying to buy the house, and we have a single broker who represents each of us. Now, why might this be a conflict of interest? Well, what is the broker for a buyer trying to do? Well, among other things, they're trying to get the lowest possible price for whatever it is that they're buying. What's the broker for a seller trying to do? Well, they're trying to get the highest possible price for whatever it is they're selling. These are two jobs which you can't do well at the same time. It's impossible to try to get the highest price for some property and the lowest price for some property at the same time. And given that real estate brokers representing people selling properties are usually paid some fraction of the sale, the broker will almost certainly work in the interests of the seller, which means that nobody is really working in the interests of the buyer. Okay, so this is one clear example of a conflict of interest. Real estate brokers representing buyers and sellers, those are two jobs which you can't do well at the same time. Another type of clear example of a conflict of interest comes in financial services. So sometimes you'll have situations where a financial advisor will represent both, say, a retirement fund, which has a pool of money from a bunch of workers who are trying to get as much return on their investment as they possibly can. And these financial advisors will also be paid by mutual funds that they invest in. Okay, so this is a little convoluted perhaps, but think about this for a second. So if you are working for a retirement fund, what you're trying to do is get as much return on your investment as you possibly can. But if you are being paid by a mutual fund for as many new investors into the fund as you can possibly find, well, all of a sudden you are, so to speak, serving two masters. You can't, what might be in the best interests of the retirement fund, what will be the best return on, what will give the best return on the investment for the retirement fund, won't necessarily pay you the most. Mutual funds might compete with one another by trying to outbid them for what they pay to the financial advisors. Now, Um, uh, Often when this happens, the people who hire financial advisors at retirement funds, for example, don't know that financial advisors are doing this. This is, I think, a key part of the situation. So often when there's a conflict of interest, not always, but often when there's a conflict of interest, it's not disclosed. Part of what makes it as shady as it is that it's kept in secret. Okay. In the Fava reading about financial conflicts of interest in psychiatry, we saw some of the possible consequences of medical researchers both working for pharmaceutical companies and reporting research or doing original scientific research. Excuse me. So, um, this is, again, a situation where, at least at its worst, these ties aren't disclosed. So suppose I'm a pharmaceutical scientist and I am paid by a manufacturer of some drug to conduct trials on the effectiveness and safety of the drug. And I run these trials and I try to get them published in a scientific research journal. And I don't say in submitting this piece of research to this journal that I work for the pharmaceutical company. So anybody who picks up this journal and reads this article might think, well, here's some disinterested, objective, unbiased scientist who's researching the efficacy of this drug, and they say it's effective, so it must really be effective. If you knew that I worked for that pharmaceutical company, you probably wouldn't take my research very seriously, or at the very least, you would take it with a big grain of salt, or you would be sort of reading it with a critical eye. Okay. Another type of conflict of interest can arise in the case of office romantic relationships. Okay. Um, these are pretty tricky, and there are some gray areas here. But I think one pretty clear case of a conflict of interest arises when you have a manager or a supervisor or boss who dates somebody who works directly underneath them. Okay, so if I am your boss and we start going out, all of a sudden I have two different sort of jobs or two different sort of sets of obligations to you, right? On the one hand, I want to be a good boyfriend, and on the other hand, I want to be a good boss. Now, being a good boyfriend, you might think, means taking somebody's interests especially seriously, listening as carefully and as charitably and as sympathetically as you possibly can. Maybe it involves giving, well, in some sense it obviously does involve giving your lover some kind of special treatment. You don't just treat them the same way you treat everybody else. Now, what does it mean to be a good boss? Well, I'm not sure, but among other things, it probably means treating all of your employees equally, not showing excessive favor to one employee rather than another, doing what is in the best interests of the company and the stakeholders as a whole, rather than what's in the interest of this or that favorite person. You think that favoritism as a boss is a moral problem. Okay, so these are two types of obligations that really don't fit very well with one another. If I am somebody's boss, I need to treat them equally. I need to treat each employee equally with equal sort of regard, not to pick favorites. And if I'm somebody's lover, then yeah, I kind of do have to pick favorites. You hope that your lovers treat you differently than they treat, random employees or whatever. Okay, so these are two types of obligations, two types of duties, two types of relationships, two types of roles that you can't perform equally well at the same time. Here, let's look at one more clear case of a conflict of interest. There's a great episode of John Oliver's TV show about the payday loan industry. And one of the phenomena that comes up in this episode is that in Texas, there are a lot of people who own payday loan companies and who also are in a position to regulate the payday loan industry in Texas. So if you own a business in some industry and you regulate that industry at the same time, well, you know, it's possible to do both of those jobs well at the same time, but it's going to be really, really hard. You're going to be really tempted to regulate the payday loan industry, not in the interests of your own constituents or the people of Texas or something like that. You're going to be tempted to ease up on regulations to make the market as favorable to payday lenders as you possibly can. Okay, so I recommend this episode of John Oliver. I'll put a link somewhere in the YouTube video so you can check it out because it's good and it's funny. Okay, I'll add that the case of Sheldon Silver that we talked about last time is also pretty similar to this, right? So if I'm an attorney representing some client who has business before the state, and I'm at the same time a legislator in the state assembly, and I'm in a position to shape the regulatory environment for my client, well, I have two different kinds of competing obligations, and it's not clear how I could fulfill both of them at the same time, right? So how can I regulate an industry in the best interests of my constituents and also do what is going to bring about the best legal outcome for my clients at the same time? Those two things are going to pull you kind of in different directions. Okay. So far, the cases that we've considered are very clear cases of conflicts of interest, cases where you have some obligation and then you inappropriately take on a conflicting obligation or incentive, or cases where you have one job and you inappropriately take on another job which you can't perform well at the same time. Sometimes you don't have such a clear case of conflict of interest. You have something closer to a borderline case, a vague case, or a sort of hazard or possibility of or threat of conflict of interest. So maybe to consider two of these hazards or threats or possibilities, we could think on the one hand of advertising. Okay, when you're advertising a product, you are trying to sell that product as well as you possibly can, and you're also trying to inform consumers about that product. Now, it's possible to do both of those jobs well, and living in the world that we live in, those two jobs are generally or very often going to be performed by the same people. But the fact that your primary obligation is to sell some product is gonna put a lot of pressure on how you inform people about the product, or frankly, whether you misinform or lie to people about that product. So I'm reluctant to say that advertising is necessarily a conflict of interest because things being what they are, the world being what it is, I don't want to say that it's always morally wrong to be an advertiser. That would be a pretty radical conclusion. Nevertheless, I do want to say that advertisers have a hazard of conflict of interest at all times, and they need to take special steps to avoid that hazard of conflict of interest or that possible conflict of interest from getting out of control. We could talk about those special steps in a little bit. Another similar sort of case, a case where there's a hazard or threat or possibility of conflict of interest, even if there isn't quite a full-blown conflict of interest, is paying retail salespeople on commission. Okay, so suppose that I own an electronics store, say, and I pay all of my employees based on the based on the dollar value of the goods that they sell. So, again, I don't want to necessarily say that it's morally wrong to pay people on commission, But I do want to say that there's a hazard to paying people on commission. There's a moral hazard here. There's a threat of possible conflict of interest. Well, what exactly? Well, think about it for a second. If you are being paid on commission, you want to upsell people as much as you possibly can. But you might think being a good salesperson isn't just a matter of selling people the most expensive thing that you could possibly sell to them. It might be a matter of selling people what they actually want. It might be in the short-term interest of you or the company to sell them the most expensive possible goods that you can, but you're likely to get more repeat customers if you sell people what's actually in their best interest, what they actually need. Similarly, there's a conflict between being a good salesperson or wanting to sell people what is actually in their best interest and wanting to sell people the most expensive possible stuff. Another possible conflict of interest has to do with the relationships between coworkers. So suppose that you are paid on commission. Well, how are you going to view other salespeople in your workplace? Not necessarily in this way, but one way you might view them is you'd view them as competitors. You'd view them as people you need to, say, steal commissions from, people who you want to undermine in one way or another. The last thing you want is for you to put in some work and that commission ultimately to go to somebody else. But you might think what actually makes for a good coworker isn't somebody who's competing with you at all times. You want a coworker to be somebody who's friendly with you, somebody you can trust, and so on. So again, being paid on commission doesn't necessarily make coworker relationships untrusting or adversarial or backbiting or anything like that. But there's a threat, there's a hazard that paying people on commission will lead to this result. Okay. So we have some clear cases of conflict of interest, and then we have some cases where there's a sort of hazard or threat of conflict of interest, which could get out of hand if we don't take special steps or special precautions to keep it under check. What, though, are the actual harms associated with conflict of interest? You might think, it's not so bad. So somebody's representing both the buyer and the seller, whatever, if it's legal, if they can get away with it, that's fine. Knock yourself out. So what if a financial advisor representing some retirement fund gets paid a little bit on the side by some mutual fund that they might invest in? It's they got to water their beak. Everybody's got to eat. So that's a reasonable question. So you might ask, well, what exactly is wrong with conflict of interest, or what are the actual harms associated with conflict of interest? I think there are at least two. One has to do with a breakdown in trust. It's really worth reflecting on the extent to which functioning markets depend on trust between the different parties in the market. So imagine that you go to the grocery store and you go to look for cans of beans. And you see a can of beans and you say, you know what? This can of beans is labeled as a pound of black beans or whatever, but how do I really know? I can't open it in the store. Maybe this person is going to cheat me. Maybe this person has cheated me in the past, but I have to come back to this grocery store for one reason or another. So, maybe I'll take some. I need to buy the black beans, so maybe I'll take some extra precautions. Say I'll take out some insurance, or I'll get some agreement in writing that the black beans are really a pound, and I'll take extra precautions to measure the black beans as soon as I take them out of the can, or this or that or the other. You could imagine a relationship between a grocery store and its customers that worked like this, where the customers just never trusted that the grocery store was selling the goods it put on display in a way that accurately represented what they were. But there would be a ton of costs associated with this, right? Nobody would want to shop in a grocery store like this. It's much better if you can just trust that if the grocer is telling you that it's a pound of black beans, then it's a pound of black beans. You can trust that if the grocer is telling you that this is lettuce and not, I don't know, some cabbage or something like that, then you can, then it actually is lettuce. So if trust breaks down, there are sort of a lot of increased transaction costs. There are a lot of increased costs that come with sort of taking out insurance, making sure that people aren't going to cheat you, and so on. So to the extent that conflicts of interest lead to breakdowns in trust, this is a serious problem. And I think it's pretty clear that conflict of interest often do lead to breakdowns in trust. The Fava article about financial conflicts of interest in psychiatry are a pretty clear case of this. Okay, I am 100% not giving you medical advice. If your psychiatrist tells you to receive some treatment or take some drug, you should listen to them. Don't listen to me for medical advice. I'm not a medical doctor. But, there's a lot of distrust in psychiatry in a lot of sort of corners of the modern world. And this distrust comes from, in part, the sense that psychiatrists are all bought and paid for, that they are not working in the interests of medical science or their patients or anything like that, that they're working in the interests of pharmaceutical companies. And rightly or wrongly, that has very negative consequences. There are negative consequences that come when you can't trust that pharmaceutical companies can work in your interests. Maybe, for example, you'll forego potentially very beneficial or life-saving medical treatment because you don't trust the people who are offering it. Okay, so one harm associated with conflicts of interest is that it can lead to a breakdown in trust in some key relationships, especially in key market relationships. Another harm associated with conflicts of interest is that you will be tempted or encouraged to fulfill your conflicting jobs or duties poorly. So we saw this in the real estate broker case. If you've got the real estate broker representing both the buyer and the seller, just because the nature of the case and the nature of the way that brokers are paid, the broker is just going to do a better job representing the seller, or is at least going to be very, very tempted to do so, or will do so in a lot of cases. If a financial advisor is representing both a retirement fund and is effectively representing the mutual funds that they're supposed to be sort of disinterested investors in, they're going to be tempted to just do whatever's in their own financial best interest, invest in whatever mutual funds are going to pay them the most, and then the retirement fund isn't going to do well, and so they're doing one of their jobs poorly. Good. So conflicts of interest aren't just sort of idle concerns, or it's not just moralizing or whining or anything like that. There are real serious harms that attend conflicts of interest in the real world. Okay, so it's important to me in this class, now that we're moving into a unit on sort of applied or concrete moral problems that arise in the workplace, what steps you can take from a managerial point of view to mitigate these problems, to bring them under control, to prevent them from arising in the first place. So what sorts of steps can you take to prevent or mitigate conflicts of interest from a managerial point of view? The table 4 from the Fava article is really, really helpful here. So this is talking about psychiatric research, but I think the ideas here can be exported to other types of other types of contexts, other types of industries that don't necessarily involve medical research or anything like that. So let's go through the items in this table and try to see how they might translate into other domains. So disclosure should become the rule in all scientific meetings and journals. Now, think about what that might mean for advertising, okay? So imagine that there was an advertisement, but you didn't know that it was an advertisement. You thought that it was, say, a newspaper article. As a matter of fact, this happens very often, especially in the like earlier days of like what they called sponsored content or branded content, where you'd have something like, you might open up, say, the New York Times Magazine, and you'd see something which sort of was formatted in the style of a New York Times Magazine article, but after you read it for a little bit, you're like, wait a second, is this like an advertisement for, you know, Noxzema or something? Like, this doesn't seem like a New York Times Magazine article. So BuzzFeed was also, I think they've gotten a little bit better about this, but especially in the early days of BuzzFeed, they caught a lot of shit for this. That they didn't do a very good job of clearly distinguishing which of their posts were advertisements for people and which of their posts were just posts that were supposed to amuse and entertain and inform people. You know, you see this on like celebrities' Instagram accounts, right? That they put a little hashtag ad at the end of whatever it is. I think Instagram requires them to do that. Maybe they're legally required to do that. I don't know. But in any case, these a very first step to addressing the problems associated with conflict of interest is just saying when you have a possible conflict of interest, saying when you're advertising something. If I'm a real estate broker and I'm representing both the buyer and the seller, each party should know who I'm representing. If I am a legislator who owns a bunch of payday loan businesses and also regulates the payday loan industry, you know, I should make it public what my stake is in the matter. I should make it public what ownership stake I have in various payday loan industries, payday loan businesses, excuse me, and I should also make public what my regulatory position is in the state legislature with respect to this industry. Okay, so disclosure. It's not just for scientists. it's also in markets in other markets in general. Okay, continuing on, Fava says, each scientific organization should have a conflict of interest advisory committee. Okay, so it might not be obvious how this might translate into another sort of context or another sort of business or industry. One way that it might translate is that you could have if you're worried that there's a possible conflict of interest in your own workplace, maybe you are subject to that conflict of interest, or you're put in that put in that position of conflict yourself, right? So you're not going to be the best judge of whether there's a conflict of interest or how to address it or solve it. So you might want to bring in a third party. So that could be somebody within the firm who you hire and say, or deputize, and you say, it's your job to spot conflicts of interest, although that person is in the firm, so they probably have a say in things as well. You could also bring in a third party. So work with some consultants, work with some outside advisors, work with people who don't have skin in the game, who don't have the jobs and relationships within the firm that would sort of put them on one or another side of the potential conflict. People who don't have skin in the game, who can come in and sort of be objective, be unbiased about what the conflicts are and how to solve them. Okay, so hiring third parties or hiring people who are sort of perhaps within a firm but outside of the scope of the possible conflict. Good. Fava continues, individual members of societies and readers of medical journals should express their dissent from presentations and articles biased by conflict of interest. Okay, so partly Fava is talking about, if you try to draw the analogy to other industries, Fava is talking about what customers could do to mitigate the conflicts of interest at a firm, but not necessarily. And from a managerial point of view, what the customers do is largely outside of your control. From a managerial point of view, you can say, well, people should have an opportunity to express concerns about possible conflicts of interest. We'll talk about whistleblowing later on in the semester, but people should be given an opportunity to raise moral concerns about how things are going in a business. And people should be invited to raise those moral concerns. Sometimes employees might feel like their jobs are on the line if they raise those moral concerns. So you might want to consider having some kind of anonymous complaint form where employees could register complaints. You also want these complaints to be taken seriously. So maybe you want to deputize somebody, hire somebody to make sure that whose job it is to answer these complaints, and you can, for example, evaluate their job based on how well the people who issue the complaints think they're addressed, or whether those complaints decrease over time or something like that. So giving people an opportunity to raise moral concerns, giving perhaps anonymously if they think raising these concerns might put them in danger, having some kind of open door policy, sort of making a show of being inviting, of solicitous, of criticism and dissent. This is one way to mitigate conflict of interest in a firm. Okay, Fava continues. Specific policies, for integrity in science by professional societies, universities, granting agencies, pharmaceutical companies. Okay, so again, partly Fava is talking about, if we're translating this into a business context, the investors in a firm. But again, which is, again, from a managerial point of view, largely outside of your control. But from a managerial point of view, the question is, how can you make the firm's policies regarding conflict of interest as clear as you possibly can? So do you have clear guidelines within your employee code of conduct or handbook governing things like paying people on commission, governing things like office romantic relationships, governing things like advertising? Do you have clear policies within governing perhaps when people should recuse themselves from decisions involving people that they have outside relationships with? So, if you're on a hiring committee and your cousin or something is up for the job, when should you recuse yourself? So there's an important question, which is, does the firm have clear policies about when conflicts of interest arise and what to do about them? How to prevent them in advance? So you can't necessarily trust people to share your sense of what counts as a conflict of interest. You can't necessarily trust people to know what to do when they encounter a possible conflict of interest. And so making these things as clear and explicit as you possibly can is a good step to take. So having clear policies about office relationships, having clear policies about sort of relationships with potential employees or contractors or suppliers outside of the firm, and so on. Okay, good. So just making things explicit, making things clear. Don't leave things up to your employees' imagination. Okay. Independent review bodies within each field for examining the issues concerning conflicts of interest. I think this is really reiterating the point about third parties that we discussed before, bringing in people from outside the firm. If you're in a position to have kind of industry, so I mean, this one thing that's worth thinking about is that often moral problems within a particular business uh, uh, are or reflect collective action problems across a whole industry. So maybe you want to avoid some conflict of interest in your firm, but you see that everybody, every other person in the industry, every other business in the industry has the same conflict of interest, and you say, well, I don't want to be the one chump who uh, is scrupulous about dealing with these conflicts of interest when nobody else is, so I'm just going to go along for the ride. Uh, you know, do what everybody else does. So sometimes it helps to have some kind of industry-wide standard regarding conflicts of interest. Um, this might come in the form of government regulation, but it could come in the form of just some sort of industry norm, or if you have some industry lobby or trade association or something like that, which sets standards within a field. Think about ways that you could kind of if to whatever extent you have influence over these things, think about ways of leveraging those trade associations, industry-wide standards, and so on, so that individual people who want to avoid conflicts of interest don't feel like chumps, don't feel like they're playing with one hand tied behind their back. Okay. Lastly, FABA talks about educational plans for recognizing conflicts of interest. So this goes along with the employee handbook point from a moment ago, that you want to just make clear and explicit what counts as a conflict of interest. But one thing that you sometimes see in a firm is that its employee handbook, which might be 200 pages long or something like that, will have crystal clear recommendations about what to do when you encounter some conflict of interest. And yet, uh, nobody actually reads the handbook. And so, you'll get this sort of thing happening at some businesses where, the first day that you show up, uh, I don't know what organizations might do something like this, but, suppose that you had a young teacher named Ian Shmolosov working for Schmucklin College. Maybe when he started working here, he got an employee handbook or code of conduct, which was incredibly long, and was told to read it, but had no incentive to actually read it, didn't have any real use for it most of the time, so he could get by pretty well without reading it. And then eventually, when the time came that he had to know what the handbook said, all of a sudden he was sort of up a creek. That's just an imaginary example. That's not something that ever happened to somebody in real life, like myself. So when you have sort of on the books rules about how to, codified in some code of conduct or in some employee handbook about how to deal with conflict of interest, you want to make sure that people actually take these rules seriously and are educated about the rules. Taking them seriously is, maybe that's a discussion for another time, but that they're educated about these rules. So, for example, maybe you don't just give employees the handbook at in the first day of work. You give them the handbook on the first day of work and test them on the contents of the handbook a week into the job or something like that. Maybe you don't just give them the handbook. You have periodic job training things where you refer back to the handbook. Maybe you post quotes from the handbook around the office. You, in one way or another, refer back to the handbook again and again in office memos or in communication internal to the firm. Okay, so it's important that the rules aren't just on the books, but that people actually know what the rules are, and that you make some effort to make sure that they know what the rules are, and that you encourage them to learn the rules and to take them seriously. Okay. Yeah, I think that's about it. So good luck on the quiz. Hope this wasn't too painful. Hope you guys are still staying safe, staying home, not coughing on each other. All right, I will see you next time. Bye. Scrapple, did I forget to put you in the lecture today?
Did I forget to put you in the lecture today, sweet boy? What do you think, Sweetman? What do you think, beautiful Sweetman? Oh yeah. Oh yeah, he a good boys. Oh yeah, he a good sweet boy. Okay. Now you're in the lecture.